Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Scottish Hellenic Society for this very kind honor of inviting me to talk tonight. And thank you to all of you for being here on such a cold evening at 7:30 at night. I really appreciate it. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion afterwards. I promise to make this as interesting as I can. I hope to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes on part of my research. So as was said, I'm a scholar of international relations. My work is primarily on the politics of migrants, refugees in the Middle East. And from the Middle East, I slowly transitioned into the study of Turkey. And then if you study Turkey, well, Greece is always part of this. So this is a mini project that emerges out of a book that I'm hoping to publish in the next couple of years. The title is Greek-Turkish Relations and Migration Diplomacy, which is part of my research. And I'll talk about this in just a minute. Greek-Turkish relations is, of course, too big a topic to cover in 40 minutes on one single evening. So what I did was I chose a specific event in recent history, namely March 2020. This is the first couple of weeks of March 2020. This is right before the COVID pandemic, if you can place yourselves back then. This is the point in time when Turkey, disappointed with how the world has perceived of its treatment of Syrian refugees, decides to open up the border. So Turkey, under President Erdogan, decides to say, well, we're opening up the land border with Greece. This is where the picture is taken from. Anybody that wants to travel into Europe out of Turkey is free to do so, which puts Greece and the European Union in a very interesting position, having to, as you can see, securitize the border. So this photo is taken from the Turkish perspective of the Pazarkule border crossing right on the land border with Greece. This is the river of Evros. So this is a conflict that takes place over 3 long weeks of March 2020. And this is the closest that the countries get in escalating this and coming into an actual conflict over the past 20 years or so. By now, we have sort of forgotten this mini crisis, in part because so many other things have happened in world politics. But I'm deciding to focus on this, just to talk a bit about how we can use those 3 weeks to understand a bit more about how these migrants and refugees fit into the relations between Greece and Turkey. Both countries became really heavily invested in what's happening at the border. They securitized it. They brought politicians, funding, all sorts of things were happening that I'll talk about in just a bit. But hopefully, what I convince you after about 40 minutes or so is that the actual crisis itself had very little to do with refugees themselves. Neither Greece, unfortunately, nor Turkey really cared about the well-being of refugees. The whole crisis was about something else. And hopefully I'll convince you that it is about something else. And hopefully we can see the history of Greek-Turkish relations in a bit of a different kind of perspective. So, where was the thing? Oh, here it is. So how would I structure this? Well, firstly, I will tell you for a few minutes on the academic discourse on this, the literature, the scholarly work on migration, on foreign policy, and on conflict, which is my area of expertise in terms of political science. I will introduce you this concept that we've been working on for the last 10 years or so, called migration diplomacy, and hopefully convince you that this is a very interesting way into analyzing diplomatic politics and regional relations, and then go into much more depth on Greece and Turkey as this key dyad of 2 states coming together from the very beginning of their creation, and how migration has featured into their history. Most of what I'll talk about will be about 2020, this couple of weeks of March 2020 and this border crisis. And we'll look at it from 3 different dimensions, from the domestic dimension, the bilateral or regional dimension, and this global or international dimension. And I'll conclude with a bit of a discussion about next steps and broader implications. And of course, I'll be really happy to hear any questions. This is still a project that is ongoing. Please let me know. Anything that is unconvincing, anything that you're not really sure about, or anything that you want to raise, bring it up by all means. So my field, which is migration and international politics. If you are to look at Greece and Turkey, when you say, let's look at Greece, Turkey, and how politics features into these 2 countries, but look at migration, right? Migrants and refugees. Well, if you were a social scientist trying to do that, you'll soon come across a couple of issues that prevent us from fully looking at this. Firstly, the first thing you need to know is that migration for us, for international relations, for foreign policy experts, has been largely overlooked. For most of the 20th century, migration has been dismissed. It was called a low politics issue, a bureaucratic kind of managerial issue that doesn't really belong in the study of international relations. Over the 20th century, we cared about the Cold War, about alliances, about decolonization, about all sorts of processes. Labor migration wasn't really that big of a deal for international relations scholars. They didn't really look at it as something that is geopolitical, something that now in 2024 perhaps seems quite ironic, but it took us quite a bit of time, up until the late 20th century, to start putting attention to the study of migration from a political perspective. Even then, however, we can still be critical, because even when we started looking at migration, we would look at it from a primarily Western perspective. What do I mean by this? Well, look at how migration is covered today, be it in Britain, in America, given the recent elections. We look at it from a particular perspective that looks at issues such as immigration rather than emigration. We look at nationality, citizenship, look at security and securitization. We look at things that matter for Western states, for Europe and North America, but may not really matter in terms of the global South, the rest of the world. And this has left most countries beyond North America and Western Europe underexamined, underexplored. One of the things that surprises my students when I tell them is that actually when you look at the levels of global migration, there's more people traveling across the global South, so within Africa or within Asia, than from those countries into Europe or North America. So the levels of South-North migration are much smaller than the levels of South-South migration. And yet we care very little about what's happening outside Europe and North America. So this is something that also prevents us from studying this a bit. And finally, even if we choose to try to look at other countries, what we see is this binary, this implicit binary that emerges that kind of frames it in an us versus them narrative. Mostly in the media, also in policy circles, but in also some of us academics also tend to fall to this binary. When we look at migration crisis, usually or frequently, unfortunately, the perspective is a very kind of reductive us versus them. They're coming at us, we need to defend ourselves against them. And the framing is very much this liberal democratic countries of destination versus these illiberal autocratic countries of origin. So even if you look at things today in America, if you look at them in the Mediterranean, you'll see this being quite strong. And hopefully by the end of this, I'll have you thinking that this is quite a problematic framing. So that's where I come in as a bit of an introduction. I'm leading an ERC project funded by the European Union. I'm now 3 years into this 5-year project at the University of Glasgow. What we seek to do is provide a more balanced perspective here, right? Look at how migration is used in politics, particularly in foreign policy, but look at it both from the perspective of sending states and receiving states. Create a bit of a balance between countries where these people are coming from and countries where these people are headed. And try to see things in a bit of a more balanced perspective and look at how migration, they become both a tool for conflict. In other words, countries coming together conflictually, trying to force each other into specific concessions, but also as a means of cooperation. So we're trying to come up with a framework that is encompassing all of this. Last slide before I go into Greece, I promise, a very quick literature review. So given all of these issues that we're facing, how do we move forward? There's a number of ways. Very quickly, a lot of scholars look at this perspective from what we call externalization. We look at how migration controls may be exported to third countries. The UK-Rwanda deal, for instance, that has been aborted, the agreement between the EU and Turkey, US and Mexico, all these attempts at sort of ensuring that people don't really come to Europe or North America. This is something that a lot of scholars study. It raises concerns again about us looking very closely into Europe and little about anything else. So it raises concerns about Eurocentrism. Other scholars do important work focusing on asylum seekers and refugees themselves. They focus on the difficulties they face. They focus on the plight of trying to traverse the Mediterranean, on trying to cross through jungles of Central America, and actually highlight the plight of these vulnerable individuals and these vulnerable communities seeking asylum. This, of course, is also very, very useful. It risks overshadowing, however, the geopolitical dimension. So if we focus too much on the individual, if we focus too much on the groups, as IR scholars, as political scientists, we don't really understand the broader picture, the high politics of it. So we need to strike a bit of a balance. And finally, those that do tend to look at geopolitics look at migration rather problematically, I would argue, as a weapon. You might have come across this discourse in newspapers, in television stations, in coverage of migration as being weaponized, as migrants being weapons or instruments. And this is, again, something that I would take offense at. This would be something that perpetuates a rather simplistic view of global politics. And it reduces individuals into weapons. So we need to find a different way forward. There are a lot of people that do shift attention outside Europe and North America. They look at the global south, and this has been super, super useful. Those of us that do look beyond the European and North American context also face a couple of challenges. The first, by looking at just the Middle East or just Africa or just Asia, we implicitly risk reinforcing this dichotomy between North and South. By looking at the Middle East and saying there's something specific about the Middle East, we tend to reinforce that, well, perhaps Middle Eastern politics is different from European politics or North American politics. And this is something that we need to problem. And finally, one of the things that we also risk is looking at the state, at the countries themselves as unitary, looking at these countries as if there's a single national interest. They act as a single unitary actor, ignoring the fact that there are NGOs, political parties, the military, the security sector, all sorts of actors that try to compete in order to shape the policy of these states. So what we do in our project is work on something we call migration diplomacy as a framework to examine two things, as a framework to overcome this and examine two things. Firstly, how migration shapes foreign policy. So how does the existence of migrants, of refugees, of asylum seekers shape countries' foreign policy? How do they respond to this? But also the inverse. How may foreign policy decisions create, impact, limit, stem, or control migration flows? So for the scientists in the room, migration features both as the dependent and independent variable in a way. It both shapes things and is shaped by things. So that's what we try to do. Enough with the theory. Here's the final bit. What we're trying to do in this project that I'll present to you for the next half an hour or so is we try to unpack the state, try to unpack these countries, and try to look at a number of actors that take place and act below the state and above the state. How can we do this? What kind of theoretical perspective can we get? Well, what I do here is borrow from one of the leading American political scientists called Robert Putnam. And Robert Putnam put forward this article about, 30 years ago now, called Diplomacy and Domestic Politics, Two-Level Games, the logic of two-level games. And he argues that any kind of political negotiation is a two-level game. It takes place both in terms of governments, but also in terms of domestic audiences. So governments have to respond to domestic pressures and then negotiate at the international level. So I was thinking, well, let's try to apply this to migration, see whether it works. And in the case of Greece and Turkey, what's interesting here is that you have these two countries coming together. Beyond the countries themselves and actors below the level of governance, you also have actors above the level of governance, primarily the European Union. The European Union acting here as a financial and normative actor in trying to shape migration at the same time. So what you have is a very complex game. You have migration taking place, governments try to control it, but also sub-state actors, political parties, other audiences, and then supra-state actors coming together. And this is what I'll try to present to you today. Migration diplomacy as this kind of three-level game across domestic, bilateral, and supranational actors. I should have deleted this slide because I think I know the audience by now, and you probably know where Greece is in the map. But I'll keep it here for just a second. Of course, we argue in this project that Greece and Turkey is a key way into studying how migration diplomacy works. And this is because I wish I had more time for the history aspect of this, but we are arguing that Greece and Turkey and the management of migration features into these countries from the very beginning. The picture on the right is, of course, the context of the Greek-Turkish population exchange after the 1923 war, which of course marks the creation of the modern Republic of Turkey, 1923. So at the very beginning of the creation of the modern Turkish state, we have cross-border mobility management at its very heart. So 1923, already we have the population exchange. A few years later, still under, of course, the Treaty of Lausanne and the status of the Greek population of the islands of Evros and Tenedos. A bit later on, under Venizelos, we have the Treaty of Friendship. And crucial in that Treaty of Friendship between the two countries is how to regulate property claims of separated communities and repatriated communities. And of course, this is a thing that repeats over the 20th century. And beyond the two countries themselves, of course, Cyprus comes in. So Greece, Turkey, and Great Britain coming together as guaranteeing powers of the island of Cyprus in 1959, of course, and ongoing issues about, of course, the Greek population in Istanbul, in Constantinople, and also the Muslim population in Western Thrace. So throughout the 20th century, over the past 100 years or so, I would argue that migration is at the very heart of how these two countries cooperate or go into conflict with one another. Fast forward to the last few years, after 2011, after the Arab uprisings, after the upheaval in the Mediterranean, the two countries are again pitted together as they play key roles in the European refugee crisis. This is 2015, 2016. They come together as key transit states of asylum seekers seeking to enter Europe through Turkey. This culminates in 2016, March 2016, the signing of the EU-Turkey deal, a 6 billion euro agreement in which the EU funds Turkey in exchange for Turkey's promises to stem migration. Turkey comes and says, well, we'll do our best to control our borders and to stop the flow of irregular migrants into European territory. This is a key turning point, I would argue, in the history of the two states. And what happens next, and the focus of this presentation, is a key aftermath of this 2016 agreement. Fast forward 4 years, Turkey, ostensibly disappointed at the lack of cooperation with the European Union, decides to effectively renege on the 2016 agreement, the 2016 deal with the European Union, and opens up its borders. It says, well, we held our part of the deal, but Europe is not cooperating. So what we'll do is essentially open up our borders again and create another mini refugee crisis on the border of the Evros River. Of course, this is a very small crossing that wasn't really used during 2015-2016, where most asylum seekers came from the Aegean via the islands and via the Mediterranean. But in 2020, President Erdogan, decides in late February, early March to announce on national media across Turkey that, well, anybody that wants to cross the borders now is free to do so. And anybody that is dissatisfied in Turkey, please take a bus and make your way to the border. We will not stop you, which creates the setting for what we'll talk about today. Essentially, hundreds, thousands of people desperately coming to the border and trying to move across into Greece and by extension, European territory. Why do we care about this? Well, we care about this because it marks a very key point in how politics features into the management of things. And I promised you 3 levels. This is the first one. This is the domestic politics level. And one of the things we need to think about is, well, why does Erdogan do this? So why would President Erdogan decide in March 2020 to unilaterally create a refugee crisis on the border? Well, a number of things come up. If you look at what's happening in Turkey at the time, a few days ago, a few days beforehand, on the 27th of February 2020, news broke in Turkish media that 33 Turkish soldiers had been killed in Idlib. This is in the context of the Syrian war. This is, for Turkey, the largest loss of forces abroad since the invasion of Cyprus in 1974. This is a huge piece of news for Turkey at the time. And one of the things, arguably, that Erdogan is trying to do is find a way to distract his audience. So I would argue, and we're looking into discourse at the point to prove that the timing of this works very interestingly for the Turkish political powers, because it allows for a distraction of the public against what's happening in Syria. At the same time, by essentially allowing Syrian refugees to leave Turkey whenever they want, President Erdogan, is trying to counter this growing media narrative present across the country that portrays Syrian refugees as having a good time. There's a large part of the media in Turkey at the time that says, well, these refugees, they've come here, they were able to find jobs, they were able to bring their families, they're enjoying themselves. It's a very problematic narrative, but a lot of media sources that succumb to this and have been portraying this. And one of the things that Erdogan is trying to do domestically is to counter this narrative. This is most obvious, perhaps, in terms of a couple of Erdogan strongholds, political strongholds, in the part of Turkey that borders Syria. This is southern Turkey, in Urfa, in Gaziantep. This is where Erdogan has really huge polling numbers. The AKP party is polling really traditionally very highly, but there's a rising opposition to Syrian refugees. This is the part of Turkey that hosts the largest number of Syrian refugees, and this is an area where we have rising opposition against Erdogan. So you can see why he would want to find a way to distract from that and to reduce this tension. And finally, only a year ago, in 2019, if you recall, we had municipal and mayoral elections in Turkey, in which the AKP party of President Erdogan suffered quite a few defeats. One of the most famous ones is the loss of Istanbul. The mayoral elections in Istanbul went to Imamoglu, who is the opposition candidate at the time, and what he campaigned on was public discontent against refugees. So he was saying, well, we need to do something about the growing number of Syrian refugees in Istanbul. And President Erdogan is quite conscious that this was a winning strategy. So arguably, what happened at the Turkish border at 2020 needs to take all of these factors into account. What about Greece? Right? Can we say anything about Greece and Greek domestic politics in terms of how they responded or how we responded to this crisis? Remember, if you remember the initial picture of Welcome to Greece, there's barbed wire, there's heavy police forces, it's a heavily securitized situation from the other side. Is that political? Or is that just crisis management? And us as political scientists, we're trying to find the political rationale behind it. And this is my argument to you, that one of the ways to understand why Greece responds the way it does is to look at how it is being governed at the time. Remember, this is 2020. The center-right party of New Democracy has come to power. One of the campaign promises that Prime Minister Mitsotakis had made at the time was to combat irregular migration. So this is part of the electoral strategy at the time. Irregular migration, combating securitization of borders. Arguably, this is a way to energize the base of the New Democracy Party by proving that 2015 and 2016 will not be repeated. Arguably, this is an opportunity to showcase that New Democracy is not only against irregular migration, but it's also a stark contrast to the previous government. So for anybody that's familiar with Greek politics of the 2010s, you might remember Syriza coming to power and having a very distinct policy of open border. So a policy where humanitarian narratives ruled, where Prime Minister Tsipras was much more keen to take a different stance towards asylum seekers than governments before or after. So for Prime Minister Mitsotakis at the time, by positioning the New Democracy Party in stark contrast to the previous government, he produces what in political science we call this rally around the flag effect, where there is a crisis and the person that you support is the leader. You cling to this person of your country's leader as somebody that will guarantee the safety and security of your people. And in the project, we go a bit more significantly to the discourse of this. If you were following the media at the time, or if you looked at coverage of this, you might have seen that one of the first things that the Greek government does is to send troops to the border. Prime Minister Mitsotakis at the center appears with this dark green kind of military outlook. He does try to essentially portray the image of somebody that is there to securitize the border. And I would argue that this fits very much into the narrative of his domestic political constituents in a very similar way to what Erdogan was doing. Not exactly the same, but you can see both countries trying to essentially use what's happening at the border for domestic political purposes. But remember, there's a second level here, which is the regional aspect. And one of the fascinating things about this is how the Greek crisis, those 2-3 weeks of March 2020, play out in terms of the bilateral relations between the countries. One of the things that we've had a difficulty with in this project has to do with collecting objective data on this, verifiable data, and I'll talk about it in just a minute. So this is why we rely on Deutsche Welle. The Germans sent a number of reporters at Evros to document the crisis. And one of the things that they say is that, well, this crisis is a humanitarian catastrophe, and it was. But it's partly because both governments have been engaged in a propaganda battle at the side. So you have these thousands of people trying to cross the border, and both governments on either side of this border engage in a propaganda battle. We have the Greek Speaker of Parliament at the time accusing Turkey of being a proper migrant smuggler. There's a lot of such quotes that we don't need to go too much into. But at the time, the far-right media essentially amplifies this kind of narrative that what's happening at the border is an attempt at Islamizing Greece. This is an invasion. This is something that if we leave it to play out, we'll be living one more 1821. This is it's a reference to the Greek War of Independence again. Of course, this kind of threat of an invasion, that Turkey is there to repeat what has been happening for the last 200 years, essentially. So you can see how the far right and media sources try to amplify this fear, leading, of course, to a lot of misinformation and propaganda. Turkey and a number of news media accuse the Greek government of human rights violations, of using rubber bullets against asylum seekers. This is thoroughly dismissed as fake news. Greek social media users are advised to verify information in order not to subscribe to Turkish propaganda, and a number of things like this. But perhaps the most stark aspect of this kind of propaganda, but it has to do with data. So one of the things that scholars of migrations are always obsessed about is collecting data, right? Like how many people are crossing the border? How many people are we talking about? We don't know. So March 2020, a day or two after this started, the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs say that, well, we've been tracking things at the border. 10,000 people tried to cross it. 10,000 people tried to cross it. We prevented all of them. Only 73 people made it through. The Ministry of the Interior in Turkey puts out an announcement the same day and tells us that 117,000 migrants had already crossed the border into Greece. So you can see the extent to which we're unaware of what's happening. A couple of days later, Turkish sources say that over 135,000 people have entered Greece from that border crossing, right? So successfully entered into Greek territory. Greek sources say that, well, only 220 have made it. So you can see the extent to which numbers fall part of this bilateral relations and bilateral politics and fall victim to this kind of propaganda battle. And we still don't know. If you try to look it up or if you try to find out how many people actually made it through, even though this is a crisis that is highly securitized, visible to local, national, and international media, and at the center of European attention, we don't know. We don't have data. And it's a very interesting aspect that it's only 4 years ago at the periphery of Europe, and we can't know for sure what happened, right? My argument is that all of this is intentional because, again, it fits into two narratives. The Turkish narrative of look at how successful we have been at allowing people to enter Europe, and the Greek narrative in terms of look at how successful we have been in strengthening our borders and controlling who gets in and who gets out. So there is a national or state level, there's the bilateral level, but there's also the international level, right? And this is where I'll stop the analysis. And arguably, there's a very interesting perspective playing out at the global aspect. So beyond the new democracy series of Erdogan AKP versus non-AKP politics, beyond the Greek-Turkish history of fraught relations over migration, the EU comes into it well and adds a whole different level of complexity to what takes place in those 2 weeks. So for Greece, one of the interesting things is that from the very beginning, the Greek state portrays what's happening there as an attack not on the Greek border, but on the European border. So the New Democracy Party and a number of political figures across the party say, well, this is we need to defend Europe. We don't need to defend Greece. We need to defend the European border. And this, again, is something that politically is quite interesting because it plays into the pro-European stance of the New Democracy Party. Again, one of the things to counterframe this would be what was happening beforehand and the anti-EU stance that the previous government had taken. So the Syriza versus New Democracy aspect here is quite interesting. And Greece comes in under New Democracy as this pro-EU power that is now essentially defending Europe. And not accidentally, a couple of days into this crisis, on the 3rd of March, what is taking place is this highly organized and stage-managed visit of the top EU officials. So the picture on the right, of course, is Prime Minister Mitsotakis, and then you have Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, Charles Michel, and David Sassoli, that are all visiting on military helicopters, of course, right? Bear in mind this kind of securitization and militarization narrative. They go to the field and they actually go to the Evros border to see what's happening, to visit the Greek side of the border, and to normatively and discursively defend Mitsotakis, of course, the New Democracy Party, and Greece. And what's interesting here as well is that fairly immediately, Greece was able to successfully lobby and receive 700 million euros in European financial assistance on the spot. So this is something that takes place that shows the extent to which Europe comes in, not only as this idea of defending European values, but also as this financial supporter for the securitization of the border. On the other side, in Turkey, this is something the EU also features, but features on the other side of this. So one of the things that Erdogan has been trying to do at the time was to get European support to create a safe zone in northeastern Syria and the Operation Peace Spring at the time. The Europeans were reluctant to support this for a number of reasons. One of the reasons why he did this is he was trying to essentially secure European support for his foreign policy initiative. But what's interesting here is that throughout this crisis, Erdogan uses the EU discursively as well, not in terms of gaining support as allies of the European Union, like the Greeks do, but as opponents. So he's saying, well, look at the European Union, look at the hypocrisy of them at the border, militarizing poor Syrian refugees that are trying to seek shelter, and they shoot them with rubber bullets. So again, the EU plays into this, but from the other side of the perspective. One of the most interesting things here is that the EU reportedly also offer money to President Erdogan. So, of course, Greece receives a number of funds out of this crisis. Reportedly, Erdogan was also offered money, but he turned it down. Reportedly, he said, well, this is not about money. It's about something else. And this is what perhaps this project is trying to get to. What is this something else that President Erdogan is talking about? How can we understand this aspect of Turkish migration diplomacy? I've talked for a long time, so how do we wrap this up? So hopefully, at least some of you are convinced that what happened in 2020 in this border crisis between Greece and Turkey over these few weeks before COVID hit and everybody was worried about other things, was driven less by a commitment to defending the rights of Syrian refugees and more about strategic state interests. Neither of these two countries effectively tried to put forth positions and policies that defended human rights. Both of them, I argue, would instrumentalize vulnerable individuals for specific policy purposes. So this is a key example of migration diplomacy at play that we see taking place elsewhere in the world much more prominently. We see this instrumentalization and commodification of asylum seekers, as we would argue. And we look also hopefully, this was logical and convincing to you that this migration diplomacy component operates across different levels. Domestically, in terms of gaining domestic support for what these governments do, in terms of the bilateral relations of the two states, and in terms of the global European perspective. One of the things that I aim to get you to think, perhaps, is to question these normative binaries that we're often confronted with, as I said at the beginning, by media actors, by policymakers, and elsewhere, and question this simplistic dichotomy of good versus bad. That one state in this is good, the liberal Western state that is targeted by an asylum crisis, and one state that is bad. It's illiberal, it's non-Western, it's authoritarian. Arguably, if you try to unpack these things a bit and try to understand the rationale of these political figures, you'll see that there's quite a bit of blame, unfortunately, to pass around, and this dichotomy doesn't really exist if you think a bit more. Also think about the European Union in terms of its dual role. Firstly, as this global financial actor that is meant to be co-opted successfully by Greece as this backer and as this financial supporter of the Greek state in its attempt to securitize, and on the other hand, as this Western actor that is normative, that talks about human rights, that talks about the right of Syrian refugees to asylum, that is to be critiqued by Turkey. So the EU comes here as a target, either in co-optation or as a critique. And finally, one of the things that is keeping us busy now in terms of our work is how does this teach us anything about politics more generally, right? So this happened 3 weeks in the Greek-Turkish border. Most of us have forgotten about this. Is there anything to be said about why we should be spending our evening talking about this? And I would argue that there are broader implications here. One of the things that becomes quite evident over time, if you look at European politics, is how often this gets repeated from 2016 up until today. The year after the Greek-Turkish border incidents of 2020, Morocco decides to open up its border and allow refugees and migrants to pour into Spain. This is the summer of 2021 for a number of other reasons that we don't need to go into. But again, Morocco uses migrants and refugees as a way to teach Spain a lesson at the time. A mini crisis emerges there. At the same time, more or less almost, in the eastern border, Belarus, under President Lukashenko, also decides to do something similar. So he copies Erdogan's playbook and he creates or tries to create a refugee crisis on the border with Poland, of all places. One of the fascinating things about that mini crisis is that President Lukashenko goes as far as to fly in refugees and asylum seekers from the Middle East. So he would fly in Iraqis to Belarus and encourage them to cross into European territory, trying to create another mini crisis there. So hopefully you see that there's a pattern, right? Something's happening here that we need to understand. And we need to understand how and why it happens and how we may be able to address it, essentially. And what this indicates, I would argue, is this bleak trend towards the normalization of coercive migration diplomacy, of the use of migrants and refugees in diplomatic relations as instrument of coercion. My area of expertise is the Middle East. One of the things that was most striking is I go back and forth to Jordan quite a lot for work. Jordan historically has been one of the key supporter of asylum seekers. It has hosted hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, of Iraqis, of a number of Syrians, of hundreds of thousands of Syrians. And it has always been quite cooperative in terms of how it does it. One of the things that would keep popping up in my interviews after 2016, after the EU signed this agreement with Turkey, is the issue of coercion. And you say, well, we've been trying to be cooperative, but look at Turkey. Right? Tried to blackmail the EU and it got 6 billion euros, and we're trying to make do with nothing. So I have them on the record. I think, well, perhaps we should have blackmailed Europe as well, right? So that leaves us with a bit of I'll leave you with a sad note perhaps for this evening, but a bit of a thinking note in terms of, well, how do we respond to this, right? Once we open up this policy instrument of trying to pay our way out of this refugee crisis, is this something that secures us in the long term, or does this essentially make more and more governments willing and eager to use this instrument against others? And what we see here across the eastern part of the European Union and the southern part of the European Union is that this crisis proliferates. So one of the things we're trying to find out now is, well, how do we respond to this, right? And what do we do? But I'll leave it for another talk because I've talked too much already. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. It was a very revealing and very interesting talk. Such a topical topic for all of us.